If you have just joined us, we will be starting shortly. Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining us for this evening's talk hosted by the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose. Before we start, here are a few pointers and some helpful information. Firstly, to check that you can all hear me, please raise your hand by clicking on the hand icon at the bottom of your screen. Thank you very much. There is a Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen where you can submit questions to the speakers. We'll do our best to answer as many as possible, although time may be limited. The chat function for this talk has been turned off. However, you may receive links from the host. If you would like to follow the conversation or share tweets, please use the hashtag IIPP State of AI. Thank you.
Hello there, and welcome to everybody. We're so happy that so many of you could join us tonight. I am Mariana Mazzucato. I'm a professor in the economics of innovation and public purpose at University College London, UCL, not to be confused with UCLA for those Californians watching, because Tim's on our panel. And I'm the director of the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose, which is hosting this event, as well as many other events, which I know lots of you have joined us for recently. So I'm going to be chairing today's discussion, and the theme of the discussion will be to rethink the future of artificial intelligence. We will be asking provocative questions around who creates it, who owns it, and who benefits from it. And we are extremely interested inside IIPP to really directly question the directionality of innovation. We often think about the rate of growth, the rate of innovation, but the direction of growth and the direction of innovation is actually a result of how we govern all the different value creators in the economy, how we govern state institutions, public institutions, third sector institutions, which actually are quite relevant, like philanthropies in different areas like health, the green economy, and as well as the digital platforms. So we need to really push further around this issue of directionality, and also map out, actually get really a better understanding of where technical developments are actually coming from. And again, what the role of the different actors are, what is the role of the military? And also asking, actually questioning some of the basic assumptions. We often hear, for example, the word open source associated with AI, but is it really open source? Is it as open source as the field claims? And also, we currently have a new grant, which perhaps Tim and I will speak about later, because both Tim and I and some other colleagues in IPP are involved in this. It's a grant funded by the Omidyar Foundation, which is actually looking at algorithmic rents, trying to distinguish between value creation and value extraction with platform economies. And so really mapping out where are those rents, but also where is the creation itself coming from. And instead of just assuming that it's this great public good that everyone's going to benefit from, being quite explicit about what understanding we currently have of who's gaining the most and how we might govern the process differently. So it's more of a common good as opposed to an opportunity to gain private rents. So we're especially happy that one of our professors of practice, Ian Hogarth, and his co-author, who will present in a minute, have written their third now edition of the State of AI report. And this, in fact, is the motivation for tonight's discussion. We'll be sort of launching the report, or doing one of its launches. And this particular edition of the State of AI report looks at all the different actors from across the public and private sectors, and looks at how they also need to update their own understanding of how fast AI in fact is developing, and again, what direction it can go. And this report is fantastic because it is truly a public good. It's free, it's on the web, and it's a real kind of act of generosity, I think, that Nathan and Ian have put this together. For all of us, especially again in IPP, we're very interested in how civil servants and government leaders can really be much more proactive as opposed to always reactive to areas like the evolution of new technologies. And this is really a very critical moment in history to think about the political implications of a new wave of nationalism for making the state of AI one driven actually, again, by public good instead of just, borders closing down and this kind of mercantilist period that we're living through where every country wants to make itself great again. And how can AI actually help us really achieve economies, global economies that are more inclusive and sustainable instead of it becoming kind of a war territory for countries to stake out their own areas within that process. And we're absolutely, again, delighted to be launching this report tonight. So let me first introduce the speakers, which include two of the authors of the report. And then I'll explain how the evening will go. So Ian Hogarth and Nathan Benaik have published this report. Ian is a visiting professor of practice at the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose. He's the co-author, again, of the report. He's an entrepreneur and angel investor with a background in machine learning. He co-founded and ran Songkick, the concert service used by 17 million people each month. And in 2018, he wrote a widely cited essay called AI Nationalism. And I'm sure he'll be speaking about those issues tonight on the geopolitical implications of continued rapid progress in machine learning. And we're thrilled that Ian actually teaches on our Masters in Public Administration around issues of AI and how important it is for governments to really have their own internal understanding and the dynamic capabilities to really have what management speak calls absorptive capacity in this space, so they can be co-creators and not just reacting to these developments. Nathan is co-author, again, as I've already said, of the report, and he's the founder and general partner of Air Street Capital, a venture capital firm investing in early stage AI and life science companies. The team's investments include, I can't pronounce these, Mapillary, which was recently acquired by Facebook. Or did you acquire Facebook? No, it looks here like you were acquired by Facebook. GraphCar, Thought Machine, Tractable, and Lab Genius. Tim O'Reilly, who's also on the panel tonight, is also, like Ian, a visiting professor of practice with us. He also is, as I just mentioned, one of our co-researchers on this wonderful new project that's just beginning, funded by Omidyar, on algorithmic rents, so rents in digital platforms. He's the founder, CEO, and chairman of O'Reilly Media, the company that has been providing the picks and shovels of learning to the Silicon Valley gold rush for the past 35 years. And if you've heard the term open source software or Web 2.0 or the maker movement and government as a platform, he's had a hand in framing each of those big ideas. Azim Azhar, which I'm sure many of you know because he hosts some absolutely wonderful podcast series. He's the award-winning investor and author of Exponential View, the highly regarded newsletter, and again, podcast on how AI and exponential technologies are shaping the future. So in terms of what's going to happen next, Ian and Nathan will present their report, and I'll ask each of our speakers to respond briefly to it. We're going to have a discussion between ourselves before we open up the last 30 or so minutes to questions from the audience, which will be fielded to me by two of our students in the center. So Ian and Nathan, I ask you now to come on and share your screen. And you'll have about 15 minutes to present the report before we have our dynamic debate around it. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Mariana. So I thought just before we start going through some of the content, I just frame why we do this. And I think Nathan and I found ourselves in quite a kind of a position of privilege because we spend a lot of time with people who are developing, new companies that are pushing the limits of what machine learning can do in various different industries, from drug discovery to insurance to agriculture. And we also spend time with some of the leading researchers in the field, working at institutions like OpenAI or DeepMind. And finally, we have, access to some of the leading policy thinkers thinking about this. And what we realized a few years ago was that those worlds weren't really interacting with each other as much as we were interacting with them. And they weren't necessarily sharing the sort of insights from each field as productively as we'd have hoped. And what we could see was that the level of trust and the level of sort of cross-pollination of ideas was lower than sort of it ideally would be. And so we thought if we try to sort of summarize all the interesting stuff we're seeing from these different communities in one place, and we share it back to those communities, hopefully we can kind of create a more joined up discourse. And I think that, you know, with a sort of a view on sort of the sort of increasing geopolitical importance of AI, we felt like creating a sort of you know, publicly available document that really summarized exactly what was going on over the course of the prior year would be helpful for policymakers and researchers looking to sort of guide their research and policymaking in a direction that was going to hopefully be good for everybody. So that's the motivation and purpose. And we sort of spend about a month every summer sort of combing through all of the academic research, interviewing lots of startups and trying to sort of scrutinize the most interesting developments on the policy side. And we also asked some of the top startups in the field to share any interesting things that they have discovered over the year that we might want to showcase. And then we get some of the sort of the people really at the coalface from some of the top institutions to review the work we've done and help us sort of make sure we haven't got any errors in it. So that's the context. It's about 170 slides long. So if you're ever having trouble sleeping, you know, I know COVID is a stressful time, then I can suggest trying to make it through to the end in one sitting, and hopefully you'll be out like a light. What we've done today is we have, rather than sort of trying to rattle through the full report with you, we're going to give you a kind of a sort of a highlights reel of some of the more you know, unusual things that we spotted in the last year that stood out to us, and try to sort of frame them in a way that is sort of, I think, going to be of interest to the community around IIPP. So the report covers 4 general areas. We first of all look at sort of fundamental research. So, you know, the people in academic labs or corporate labs like DeepMind and OpenAI, Facebook AI Research Lab, who are working on new ways to get machines to do smarter things, and the general norms in that area. Then talent. So, you know, how you know, what sort of is happening in the world of AI research and commercialization, what is happening in terms of which countries are producing the most interesting things, what is happening to salaries, things like that. Then we go into look at industry, so not just the larger players like Google and Apple and Facebook and Nvidia and Arm, but also the emerging startups that are doing fascinating work applying machine learning to different industries. And then finally, we sort of look at the political dimension. So, you know, how have governments been responding to specific aspects of the technology? What geopolitical developments have there been? And how have lawmakers been sort of starting to legislate around some of this emerging technology? So I'll go through a few slides and then Nathan will go for you and we'll keep handing back and forth. So within the sort of the research area, one of the things that we thought was really interesting was this question of how open AI is. And, you know, AI as a field has a sort of it's very much kind of housed within the scientific tradition of openness and peer review. And the archive, which is sort of a sort of preprint server where people publish their work for sort of the community scrutiny before it goes to a journal, is sort of probably the most active place to understand, you know, what is happening on the research side of things. But an engineer in London had a very clever idea, which is basically look at how many of the papers that were being uploaded also included the code that was used for that research work. And he sort of tracked over time how this has changed and found that roughly 15% of all of the papers that were published their code. And that we feel is quite an indictment of the state of openness actually in the industry. And it demonstrates that, you know, while people are being, you know, open about some of the core ideas, they're not being open about the underlying software, and that inhibits the the extent to which scrutiny can be applied, and we can sort of interrogate the work for reproducibility and accountability. The next interesting thing we found is just the scaling up of some of these large models. So this is a sort of a historical view of how many parameters there were in a given machine learning model. And the number of parameters essentially is sort of a sense of how tuned the algorithm is, and how minutely optimized it is. And one thing you can, I think, generalize here is to say that the more parameters you have, the more compute, the more you have to spend on compute to train your algorithm to produce a trained system. And so this sort of shows over time the number of parameters, and you can see that you go from systems with kind of 100 million parameters to systems with a billion parameters, then 10 billion parameters. And in the last year, you had the first system with over 100 billion parameters, which was OpenAI's GPT-3 system. So what that means is you have these monstrous models dominating the sort of hottest area of AI. Increasingly those models require quite a significant compute budget. So the example of GPT-3, which is this sort of huge model, the experts that we've talked to have suggested that perhaps the compute budget for that model was around $10 million. But actually, the real budget for this kind of work is often larger than that, because in addition to the sort of the final model run, you also need a large budget to be able to experiment with these large kind of models and run different experiments and fail sometimes and succeed sometimes. So we think that in general, the sort of the two organizations that are really pushing the boundaries here, OpenAI and DeepMind, are potentially have compute budgets in the sort of order of $100 million a year, which is a very large budget, and constrains the sort of the kind of organizations that can make progress in this area.
So here we'll switch gears a little bit and discuss some of the work that's been coming out in the field of biology and healthcare as it relates to machine learning. And similar to the slide we presented before, where Ian talked about the archive database as being a store of all the most recent and historical papers in machine learning. Here we're looking at a database called PubMed, which is essentially a similar repository, but serves the purpose of indexing papers in the life sciences. And what we noted actually in the last few years is a significant inflection in the number of papers published per year that involve machine learning methods, but applied in areas of biology. And looking at the last few years, that growth rate has been something on the order of 50% year on year. And papers published since 2019 account for just over a quarter of all papers since 2000. So this is a real inflection point, and this is something that we're terming biology is experiencing its AI moment, which is really to say that the next few years we believe is going to be this sort of Cambrian explosion of applications of machine learning in areas of biology. And so to highlight a couple of areas that are particularly interesting, I'll run through a few examples. What we're showing here is this idea of chemical synthesis. So this you can essentially think about as a cooking experiment of how would you make a particular dish. And so to make a cake, you have a bunch of ingredients, and you have to understand in what ratio you add each ingredient, and in which sort of sequence you add those ingredients. And so very similarly in chemistry, if you want to make ibuprofen, you have to synthesize it from starting materials. And that task of understanding how do you combine different starting chemistries to ultimately yield ibuprofen is something that chemists have been studying for many, many years, and use databases of millions of reactions that they comb through to understand this kind of combinatorial conundrum. And so what we show here is actually that some of the language models that Ian talked about in just a few minutes ago have now actually been repurposed to chemistry, essentially treating chemicals as sequences of letters. And so machine learning models are essentially learning the language of chemistry and allowing chemists to come up with these kinds of chemical recipes much, much faster and sometimes more accurate. And this is interesting because it gets us into this area of drug discovery, which, as many of us know and maybe appreciate, is an incredibly expensive area, which typically costs on the order of $1 billion to develop a drug, and sometimes over a decade of preclinical and clinical work. And so, in situations where we need to come up with therapeutics a lot faster than the current manual stepwise process of humans coming up with hypotheses and designing experiments and conducting them manually, machine learning has lots to add in this process. And so in this slide here, we're presenting some work that was conducted at the Broad Institute, which is concerned with the problem of discovering novel antibiotics. And this problem is massive because we don't have enough antibiotics to fight all the different bacterial diseases that we face. And bacteria are very good at evolving resistance to the antibiotics that we do have. So this work is actually using machine learning to essentially learn the rules of antibiotics from a training data set, which is examples of antibiotics that work and antibiotics that don't work. So once these researchers have a model that can understand and kind of distinguish molecules that work and don't work, they can put that model to use on millions of different possible antibiotics, and essentially ask the model to comb through and suggest molecules that might work. And then the downstream experiments are where the scientists actually validate which ones of those model-based suggestions do work. And what's exciting here is that they've discovered a novel antibiotic, which is not only effective in lab experiments in Petri dishes, but it's actually also effective in mice. The next example that we point to is actually interesting work between a collaboration of startup in London called Zoe, and then the Public Health Service in the UK, and several research institutions in the UK and in the US. And it asked the question of, can we figure out what symptoms are actually most indicative of COVID? And can we use this large data sets that have been generated through citizen science experiments, which is to say people across the UK who voluntarily submit symptoms that they have and when they face them and whether or not they have COVID. And what's exciting with this study is that it only launched in March, and since March to now has about 4 million people that are contributing data points about their experience with COVID. And the output of the study was that this collaboration managed to find that loss of smell and loss of taste were actually bona fide symptoms of COVID before the UK government and NHS officially approved them, and that both of these symptoms are actually predictive of positive COVID patients.
So I think at some point we're going to talk about the political challenges around AI, and I thought I'd highlight an interesting example, which is what has happened around the attempt to crowdsource a COVID antiviral. So there is a startup called Postera, and Postera is the startup that employing the technology that Nathan referenced a few slides back around chemical synthesis, and you can think of that as kind of a speeding up the process of designing synthesis pathways as being an accelerant on all sorts of aspects of the sort of drug discovery value chain. And so when COVID hit, the team at Postera thought, what can we do given we have this technology that can speed up this part of this process to contribute to fighting COVID. And so what they did is they created something called the COVID moonshot, which was essentially making their synthesis technology available for free and allowing people from all over the world to submit potential compounds to identify a COVID antiviral. And they found several high potency compounds, and there are various sort of animal trials sort of underway now. So I think it's a great example of where, if this technology is sort of freely available as a kind of global public good, it can potentially be of great service in times of crisis, and potentially show a way to migrate some of these ideas into a global public good framework outside of times of crisis. The other interesting development that has a sort of strong political dimension is the work that's been sort of happening on privacy preserving distributed machine learning. And that's a bit of a mouthful, but the core idea is that you can train a machine learning model on data that you don't see, that might be in lots of different places. So, rather than, if you wanted, let's say, just take an example of a medical imaging data. There's some biopsy images in Germany, some biopsy images in the UK, some biopsy images at a hospital in the US, and some individuals with biopsy images. Once upon a time, someone would have said to you, what you have to do is you have to send all of those images to a single centralized location where you have to trust that party to then make good use of your data, protect it, and produce a model that then benefits from all that data. And the core proposition was, you have to trade innovation for privacy. You lose privacy, but you gain on innovation. And since then, there's been this sort of flurry of innovation around privacy preserving distributed machine learning, led by really championed by this project OpenMind. And what they've done is they've figured out various powerful techniques that allow you to not have to share the data with the person who is developing the model. And this is powerful because it allows all sorts of organizations, countries, and individuals to contribute data to a sort of shared model without ever actually sharing their underlying data. And these techniques have been sort of developed over the last few years, but now actually you're getting large academic consortia and companies collaborating in this way, sharing data, training a sort of shared model, but without actually ever losing privacy. And this is, I think, very interesting because it kind of presents an opportunity to create economic value in a very deliberate way at the intersection of organizations. So rather than having to think about states and companies as kind of hard boundaries where, if you want to build something together, you have to have a sort of formal, business development deal, or you have to have a, some sort of data licensing deal where you sort of, you scrutinize each other's data standards. This allows lower trust actors to collaborate together, and it allows us to create value at the intersection of all sorts of different entities.
So next we have a fairly detailed talent section, which really we include in the report because so much of progress in machine learning is driven by people with academic roots, whether that's PhDs or master's degrees or postgraduate degrees. And so it's important to understand where talent who's contributing to the state of the art in machine learning is coming from, and whether we have enough pools of future talent and whether we can do anything to improve the status quo. And so in this section, we really tease out two key slides. And so here we talk about a topic which in the machine learning industry is like fairly well known, but sometimes not appreciated enough. And that's really the idea that so many machine learning professors who used to be part of academic institutions in the last couple of years have departed their academic institution for a variety of reasons, whether that's to do with funding, to do with frustration over writing grants, to do with a desire to apply their work towards the industry or not do teaching anymore. And they've departed those universities to gain employment in technology companies. And in particular, those technology companies include organizations like Google, DeepMind, Amazon, and Microsoft and Facebook, amongst others. And what we've noticed is that there's been a huge inflection in this departure from academia into big technology companies. That's only a couple years old, really. And we think that has important implications for whether we have enough academic role models that can teach and nurture new generations of talent who are interested in contributing to academic science and staying in those organizations. But also enough role models who can coach students towards career paths in industry and in entrepreneurship. And the second thing we pull out is really this idea that the rich are getting richer to some degree. And so here we look at data that refers to a major machine learning conference called ICML. And every year around these conference times, the papers that are submitted to those conferences for appearance are published, and their organizations that are affiliated with the authors are also published. So we can go through all the submissions and acceptances and look at the organizations that had their papers accepted and essentially count how many papers per organization featured this year and how does that compare to years in the past. And the graph here that we're showing you is essentially just the delta between ICML 2020 and ICML 2019 as it relates to the organizations with the top gain in number of papers accepted. And so what you can see is that the top 5 organizations here, including Google, Stanford, MIT, Berkeley, and CMU, have all massively gained in the number of papers that they've had accepted, which is essentially a surrogate for their leadership in driving the status quo of machine learning development. And to a certain extent, like there are some universities in Europe, or broadly like ETH and Oxford, that have gained somewhat, but nowhere near as much as American organizations. Next here, we switch into the industry segment of the report, where our goal is to highlight key applications of some of the technologies that we've outlined in the research section and consider to what extent they've had economic value that's been created for their respective applications. And so on this slide here, we look at one of the most important criteria through which the industry is judging whether AI in life science and drug discovery actually creates value or is hype. And here what's really exciting is that a UK-based company called Exscientia has managed to use machine learning on a large body of potential drugs that act against the serotonin receptor, which is responsible for modulating mood and is associated with OCD. And they've managed to develop a drug through their machine learning methods in collaboration with a Japanese pharmaceutical company that's now sufficiently good in preclinical studies that it's made its way into a phase 1 clinical trial in Japan, which is the first of its kind in the AI meets drug discovery segment. And so we think is an important signal that this ecosystem around machine learning and drug discovery is actually maturing towards creating some of the outcomes that the traditional drug discovery ecosystem would expect. Next, we consider this topic we discussed earlier of all this amazing development in large language models, including GPT-3 and others, that are getting incredibly good at understanding large corpuses of language and allowing users to ask questions of that language, of that corpus in natural language. And one of the most obvious tools that we use every day that's built on this kind of natural language understanding is search in Google. And what's really impressive is that over the span of 12 to 18 months or so, assuming the original paper that described this technology being submitted in arXiv was the date at which it was actually submitted and wasn't held back for any other reason, managed to make its way from R&D into production, serving billions of queries a second in Google and Bing search, and now gives you that kind of search experience where you can ask a question and the search engine will identify the corpus of text within a longer page where your answer is embedded, and allows you to ask questions in a much more natural way without having to understand how to do these kinds of Boolean searches that I think a lot of us have sort of hacked our brains to figure out over the years to make search work for us. So this kind of rapid translation from R&D into production is a major milestone in machine learning. And we think that this application in search is one of the most telling.
So in the interest of making sure we allow enough time for questions, I'm going to wrap up by talking about another area in which research has migrated much more rapidly into the real world. So, I think it is really, really stunning that the slide that Nathan talked about, the last slide, you've gone from research being published to being deployed in production in the world's, preeminent search engine. But the other area where we've seen research migrate is for military uses. And so last year we covered the work that DeepMind did on StarCraft 2. And now you're starting to see military organizations taking those ideas around deep reinforcement learning, which is a very powerful technique that's been developed, and sort of experimented with on computer games, and applying it to military settings. So, you have the US Army Research Lab starting to basically have a similar research agenda to what DeepMind have been doing with StarCraft. You also have a wave of startups that have raised very large amounts of capital to basically apply machine learning to, cutting edge military techniques. So companies like Anduril and Rebellion Defense, raising, $100 million type amounts of money to basically apply the techniques we've been talking about in the research section to a battlefield context. And I think perhaps sort of most unsettlingly, you have this sort of demonstration funded by DARPA called Alpha Dogfight, where essentially there was a contest organized to see how well an AI could compete against a human at a sort of virtual dogfight, flying around a sort of a fighter jet. And the various teams that competed, people like Heron Systems, Lockheed Martin, they used the exact same technique that DeepMind used for AlphaGo and AlphaStar, this technique of deep reinforcement learning, and they used it to develop an agent that could could out-execute a human pilot in these dogfighting tournaments. And I think that this really demonstrates the dual use nature of this technology, where you think you're developing something that is is primarily going to be used to in an academic context to push forward thoughts around what a machine learning system is capable of, but actually the same techniques can quite rapidly migrate into a military context. So I think that's where we'll maybe kind of call time at that point in terms of walking through the aspects of the report. There's a ton more there, lots on geopolitics, on economics, and a ton more on research and novel applications. But I want to make sure that we have time for the panel and time for the Q&A. So I think I'll hand it back over to Mariana now.
Great. Thank you so much, Ian and Nathan. And precisely because this report is free for everyone to read on the web, everyone can actually do their little deep dives on the bits that maybe they missed from the presentation that they'd like to know more about. But I think what's so interesting that came out of both of your parts of the presentation was actually that there were some questions that were being asked for AI to answer. Whether it's from DARPA, the military, the pharmaceutical companies, the startups in that space. And so the question of who's asking the questions, how do those questions get framed is really interesting. Of course, we all know DARPA actually got us the internet. And it was really clear what the question was. They wanted the satellites to communicate, and the internet was the answer to that. And, in many ways, AI, like the internet, is a general purpose technology. That's economics lingo for big technological changes that are not just tinkering on the edges, but really affect how we produce, how we distribute, how we consume, and in some ways, how we imagine the future. And again, the different biases that exist, the different issues around who's actually setting the agenda, the whole question about the military is fascinating. But it was also quite interesting how, with Nathan's examples, at least that part that he was talking about, there was so much about pharmaceutical research, and we're living through a health pandemic. And we often talk about the need to race towards solutions, right? The race for a vaccine. But I think what's really interesting when we pose problems is how we govern the solution. So, the World Health Organization has been talking about the need for a people's vaccine. And if you want a people's vaccine, you actually have to govern the intellectual property rights in a particular way. So they've been talking about a need for pooling the patents, for example. So I think it'll be really great if in the discussion, and I'm going to start off with Tim, we can get more to the issues of how is the governance of AI happening, and do we actually have metrics around public purpose and public value, areas that IAPP very arrogantly says that is the leader of in the world in terms of the thought leadership required to rethink public value and public purpose. What are the discussions being had around how much do we know about how we're governing, pharmaceutical research now with AI, and how the agenda is being set, and how we are perhaps misgoverning that because we're not admitting that there's particular kind of interests at play. So with that, I'll hand over to Tim. And you have about, 5 to 7 minutes to talk about your reactions, and then we'll come back to you also in the general discussion.
Yeah. Let me start by saying that the things that jumped out at me the most were not, for starters, about governance. They're really about the fact that we often get surprised by the directions that a new technology takes. So if you think about, for example, personal computing, and then you think about what would people use computers for back in the IBM mainframe days, and you realize just how much surprise there was in the new direction. And I think we're starting to see that in this report with these immense breakthroughs starting to appear on the horizon in biomedical research, for example. And one of the things that suggests that the future may not be like the past in the domains in which AI has an impact. And so that upends a lot of our thinking. We assume that it's going to be all the same kinds of companies. It'll be some kind of extension to our current technologies. And it may well just open up entirely new markets for us. And that's, I think, a very exciting message from this report. The second point I wanted to make, which was really about open source and the fact that the quarter of the papers in bio did not come, only a quarter of them came with source code. But I would point out that in AI, the source code is not really the critical axis of freedom. The cost and the possibility of lock-in is all in the creation of the models. And so the question, really is to what extent can you build on the models? And I think you actually can pretty well in many cases. Just in my own company, we've recently built a new search engine, and we basically took the model trained, by Google, the BERT model, and then we basically added training on our particular corpus of content, and we built an incredibly much more powerful search engine. So, from the axis of code reuse, there really are some interesting opportunities, even if the source code is not provided, and that's really worth thinking about. The third point I wanted to make was on the fighter jet example that was provided. The most fascinating thing there, which really echoes what happened with AlphaGo, is that the AI used strategies that the human didn't contemplate. It's not that it out-executed humans on the strategies that humans chose. It actually made different choices. And again, that's, I think, both a hopeful and a frightening thought about AI, because it means as we apply these systems, they aren't using all of our received knowledge, which means they're immune to some of our preconceptions that are wrong, but they may also be immune to some of our values that we treasure. So it's just that's a warning message, and that is where that kind of brings me around to governance. And the question here is, how do we govern AI systems? I think is a challenge, because right now AI is embedded in a governance system that is actually pretty badly broken, and that's really corporate governance. Most of the work on AI, the leading work, as we saw in the migration of researchers from academia to big companies, the fact that government is far behind some of these big companies. They're big companies, and those big companies have as their overriding objective to increase their profits. And that may not be the kind of message we want to give our AIs, that's what they should be doing for us. And so I think there's a real question here of, we need to back up from the question of AI governance in the small and ask ourselves AI governance in the large. That is, how do we govern the entities that are deploying AI, and not just how do we build better rules into the way the AI itself operates?
Really great set of questions, Tim. Your video is freezing a bit, but we heard you perfectly well. Azim, how about if you come in now? You've been really on the forefront in terms of nurturing and galvanizing fascinating discussions globally between businesses, policymakers, as well as philanthropies around the kind of social and strategic implications about the recent developments in AI. So please come in with your thoughts before we open it up to a wider discussion.
Thank you, Mariana. Well, the report is fantastic in its third iteration. Even the first iteration is worth going back to read. I would say that one of the things that really is important to take away from the work that Ian and Nathan have done is that this is quite a pragmatic, soberly presented report that very clearly presents some incredible results. I mean, there's one particular chart which shows the level of complexity of these AI machines, that the number of parameters is how Ian referred to it. And you see a 1,000-fold increase in the complexity of these machines within a year or two. But to put it into the practicality of where the discussion should lie when we talk about AI, I think it is the space of the discussion that we're having today. And so it's great that we don't have discussions about artificial general intelligence coming out through the report, which is more the realm of science fiction. The thing that particularly interests me about this set of technologies comes back to your observation as to whether AI is likely to be a general purpose technology. And it seems to have the hallmarks of a general purpose technology, in the sense that it builds on previous technologies. It can be applied in very, very many different domains, both different industries, but also different parts of what we might have called value chains. When we've seen GPTs, general purpose technologies, in the past, they arrive, they've had significant impacts, not only on the fundamental political economy, but also on aspects of the social contract. So the question that I spend my time thinking about is, what are the impacts that this is going to have on those two domains, the social contract and the political economy? And I'll draw one particular part out, which I think brings some of the themes that Ian and Nathan identify, which is that there is a rich get richer phenomenon that we see in technology markets, and that we've seen for 30 or 40 years since the first technology platforms were started to emerge. That is, the platforms that get marginal advantage get more advantage, and they continue to get more advantage. And AI seems to have those sorts of characteristics. And there are a couple of interesting loops beyond the data and the model building that Tim alluded to. One of those loops is also around the talent. I mean, fundamentally, AI is something that is built by humans, so it needs people in order for you to build it and compete with it. In that context, the corporate governance question, or the governance question within the commercial realm, the question to ask is that does our corporate governance model support this? So I rather naively think of corporate governance in the era of the industrial age being one where you can assume diminishing marginal returns, that at some point the gravitational pull of the size of an organization or the complexity of that organization prevents it getting much, much larger. We haven't seen that happen in technology markets. And I hypothesize that we actually have these increasing returns with respect to technology platforms powered by AI. And that raises a very different set of governance questions that we need to think about, for which, to sort of give you a preview of my answer is, how do we create more public goods around these technologies, whether it's the data sets, whether it's the computing infrastructure, whether it is fundamental layers of the technology that are delivered as public parks.
Great, thanks so much, Azim. There's some absolutely fascinating questions coming in from the audience. We had 250, now we have 200. People are obviously going to their dinners or gin and tonic. So before we all go that way, I want to first give Ian and Nathan an opportunity to respond to some of the comments by Tim and Azim, and then I'll field you some of the Q&A from the broader audience.
So maybe I'll go first. I think that this sort of GPT theme is very important, and I guess the question I think about a lot is, I think that AI is a GPT, but I also think it might be the most important GPT we've ever come across. And the reason I think that is, if you look around us, everything around us is a product of intelligence. And so if we get synthetic intelligence, then basically everything's up for grabs. And so I think one of the reasons for writing this report and trying to capture the breadth of things this is touching and the rate of change in lots of different areas is to basically try to get policymakers and people thinking about this to stop sort of lumping AI in a bucket alongside like blockchain and fintech and quantum computing, but sort of say, actually, this is a bit different and we need a different sort of more expansive point of view on it. I think to Tim's point about kind of, how much can you build on the foundations that are public? I mean, he's completely right about, I see startups every day long taking BERT and putting it into production in interesting ways. But I think that in the limit, the access to sort of the very most powerful systems in the world is increasingly becoming sort of bifurcated. And I think that the stuff that DeepMind and OpenAI are doing, they're kind of out ahead of everyone else, and they're not really having much competition anymore. And so I think that the sort of the race towards the most powerful model on the planet, I think, is increasingly sort of a pretty narrow one, and one that the average research lab or company can't participate in.
Can I ask you a quick question just about that, just to confirm the numbers? So do you think that's a result of government budgets themselves having kind of fallen compared to what they used to be in real terms, say during the Apollo kind of program? So the fact that the corporate money for AI amongst the big companies like Google is so much larger actually than any even DoD funding towards this. How much is this absolute versus relative?
I think it's actually not a function at all of budget sizes. It's a function of mission-oriented clarity. So, the actual numbers are tiny. $100 million in computer year is nothing compared to any military budget. I mean, the UK is that's like, whatever, like 1% or something of our military expenditure. So I think it's a function of sort of saying, by government saying, we want to do a sort of, an Apollo approach here. We want to do a sort of mission, or we want to build the CERN or the Human Genome Project here that really takes an expansive view to sort of publicly funded innovation. I think on the governance questions that were raised, I think that Tim is completely right that this is embedded in a sort of, a relatively sort of, it's embedded within corporate governance, right? And so, you do have interesting things like the Google bottom-up protests against this stuff being used for sort of the Maven project. So there is some sort of some novel sort of developments around how corporations are able to act here. But ultimately, we are lacking governance at the highest level here. You have the two most powerful organizations that are pushing this stuff forward, both as part of private companies, both with relatively little governance and oversight. And I think that's very scary, frankly, when you think about how powerful this technology is becoming. And I'll hand over to Nathan now.
Well, can I just jump in real quickly?
Sure.
And that is the analogy that we use matters for thinking about this. And so one possibility that I think everybody's sort of thinking about right now is that building the biggest AI model is kind of like building a piece of software, but it's at least possible that it's much more analogous to building a chip fab. And you didn't say, oh my gosh, because Intel has built these processors, they're now in charge of everything. And I do think that the fact that you built say a language model like GPT-3, to the extent that certainly if it's not, the governance issue isn't necessarily who controls it, it's who has access to it. And so I wonder a little bit about whether we're using we're using the right analogies for where this is in the future technology stack.
Yeah, I mean, I think to some degree it depends on the ultimate goal you're optimizing for, because I think one of the things we highlight in the report is like this real just bifurcation of agendas between trying to reach AGI through one model learns it all and as big as possible and requires lots of computers, and then the other kind of diametrically opposed agenda, which is the rapid translation of ideas, maybe not even code, but just ideas of how to frame problems, and coupling that with kind of the domain specificity that is, can only be acquired through lots and lots of, professional career experiences. Is definitely the case in life sciences. And I think although even achieving AGI would be fantastic, of course, but before we get there, there's going to be so much impact that'll be derived through collaboration between different sectors. And that's, I think, where openness matters, because openness sort of enables everybody to be on the same kind of page to understand what each other is talking about and have the best kind of communication layer. And it's oftentimes very complicated, for even the experts to understand, some topics in a separate field of machine learning. And so not even mentioning how hard it is sometimes for people outside of machine learning to understand the nuances of how to describe their problem in a way that a machine learning person can solve it. So I think to us, like, that's where openness is really important. And if we also consider that every technology company is built on open source, and if machine learning is the most powerful lever on top of technology, then it sort of increases even in significance that that open source and open data to some degree and open models are not the standard if we want to have like the economic value trickle through the economy in lots of different ways that is not just concentration of power.
Well, but part of that, though, does have to do, though, with what kind of access there is to the technology. Kind of using this analogy of the chip fab. If the people who made the chips had said, we're not going to sell them to anyone else, we're just going to build on them ourselves. Whenever there's an attractive new market, we're going to use our inside knowledge to dominate it. You would have one kind of world, and the other says, well, we're keeping our knowledge of how to make these things proprietary, but we are making them available as a commodity, or as a common good that's available to everyone. Those are different market structures. And so to me, a lot of the competition policy in all of this has to do with how are those people acting. How are they using their power? Are they working and they building an open market, or are they building a market where they're immediately turning and using their inside knowledge to compete with anybody who does something innovative?
Yeah. Just to make this a bit more spiky, actually,
I also wanted to come back in after. Okay, Ian, go. But then I'm trying to.
I mean, chip fabs right now are kind of the sort of the geopolitical sort of choke point on all of this, right? Taiwan's TSMC is basically at the center of like all of the complexity between China and the US right now. That's like, they basically have the elite manufacturing process. In theory, what happens to TSMC dictates the entire path of, the AI industry at the moment. And America's sort of domestic production, China's domestic production massively lags what is going on in South Korea and Taiwan. So I think it's, it can look like a sort of, like a big lead thing that doesn't really inhibit innovation, but actually I think it is maybe more of a choke point.
I want to come back to this question about how these firms behave in the market. I mean, what we've established over the last decade is that the two-sided platform, which has become the business model for most of the companies building in the digital environment, is a model that lends itself to rent seeking within small segments, whether it's Uber within taxi rides, or Deliveroo within meal delivery, or Google within advertising. That is the behavior that you start to observe. And as we start to move more and more into business value that is delivered across two-sided markets, the question is, why would these companies who are enabling these two-sided markets through AI tools behave any differently than the ones that have gone before them? And the problem that you run into, as we've seen with respect to the US Postal Service and its ability to deliver in the US, is the privatization of what were typically public infrastructures, or in some cases, a civic space in the case of Facebook. So for me, the governance question is not just the corporate governance question. There is also a social governance question, which is, where do we want this enclosure movement to stop, and how do we want to observe it? And the technology that really enables this and accelerates this is ultimately AI. And it doesn't even have to be AI at the cutting edge scale of OpenAI or DeepMind that Ian and Nathan have talked about. It can just be a more moderate last year's version, grabbing the data from both sides of the market, accelerating the quality of the product, locking it in, and ultimately privatizing something that we have traditionally thought of as a public resource.
Yeah, I think that's right. And you look at an industry like pharma, which is basically built on rent seeking. If, for example, AI were to radically reduce the cost of drug discovery, to what extent would those benefits be passed on to society, and to what extent would they be captured solely by the pharma companies, is a governance question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Hence our report on that, the People's Prescription. How do you govern health innovation for public value? Can I just
I was queuing you up, Mariana.
Yeah, but I rant about that all day. At this time of day, I'm tired, so I'm happy for you guys to keep going. But just one question. I mean, I've always been fascinated by how, we talk about, algorithms and machine learning, but actually we still ask super stupid questions sometimes. And it's almost like a choice of where the kind of smart and, questions are being asked that actually require all this immense learning power versus the ones that we choose to ask stupidly. So I would give an example of the bedroom tax that the UK government had some years ago as a really kind of poor question in terms of the need for data. It was literally, for the housing estates, it was, people living in what in the US are called projects here, social housing estates. How many kids do you have? Or how many people live in the house, and how many bedrooms are there? And if one number is bigger than another, in order to save money, the public budget on social housing, you were kicked out and actually moved somewhere else in the city, regardless of your networks, what the kids needed, whether they were autistic or not, et cetera. And yet other questions, for example, around personalized medicine, have massively benefited from AI. But there was a choice. I mean, I really believe there was a choice to ask one question in a really poor way that almost required no algorithmic power, and another one around personalized medicine that it's almost infinite what you can do with with that level of granularity. So how much of this is also not just governance, but choice of where we actually care? And that's where the missions issue comes in, right? Because so much of the GPT, general purpose technology development, historically has actually come from wartime questions, which we actually cared about because you want to win the war. It's seen as urgent. It's a security need. So, turning these more social questions around strengthening the welfare state. So Hilary Cottam, another one of our visiting professors who also presented her book recently with us around rethinking the welfare state. If we actually really cared about strengthening welfare states and all the public services that are around them, we could be asking questions that could really then benefit from a lot of the technological developments you're talking about. But there was a choice made not to.
Yep.
Sorry, that was a long rambling question, but over to you guys, and then I'm going to start feeding you some of the Q&A. I don't know if you want to respond to Azim's question, or should I start reading some of the questions?
Well, let me just throw in this one quote that I love. This is from Paul Cohen, who used to be the head of AI research at DARPA in the US. And we were at a panel, and he said something I immediately wrote down and been quoting ever since. He said, "The opportunity of AI is to help humans model and manage complex interacting systems." And when you talked about your bedroom tax question, that's exactly the kind of opportunity where we have the ability to have these cognitive tools that let us answer much more complicated interactions and make better public policy decisions, make better corporate decisions. And the question is, are we going to basically try to just turbocharge our old strategies, or are we going to use this to develop new strategies that could only be carried out with the help of these tools? And I think that's really the big, most interesting, fascinating, and challenging question.
Great. So Ian and Nathan, since you look quite calm there, I'm just going to start reading some of these questions to you. Okay, I'm going to read two at a time and then just let you respond, as well as if you want to respond to anything that was said previously. So a question, oh God, where'd it go now? It's Caroline Galvan, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it properly. The panel is mentioning corporate governance a lot. Are we really talking about regulation, including the concern about monopolies? And how can governments cooperate to govern and regulate companies such as DeepMind and OpenAI? And a related question from one of our PhD students who's super smart and studies this as part of his PhD, Josh Ensminger. He says, what advice do you have for regulators looking at whether or how platforms are actually exercising monopoly power? This question, of course, goes to the heart of our research project with Tim.
Maybe I'll start with the question of kind of entities like DeepMind and OpenAI. So I think that there's sort of, when it comes to those kind of organizations, the real question is, in the limit, how would you want to have acted now if you felt like there was a good chance that one of those organizations might develop, super intelligent machines in the next decade, say? And that is their stated purpose, that is their, competitive rivalry to be the first to do it. And very explicitly, that is what the agenda is. And so I think if we have a machine that essentially you can ask any question and get the right answer back, the kind of to sort of paraphrase what Tim said about the potential of this technology, the real question is who should own that? And I think the only sort of straightforward answer is we should all own it. Humanity should own it. And so the challenge for regulators is basically how do you regulate in a way that captures the scale of that challenge? And I would argue that the only answer is something like what Azim was saying around global public goods. And I think, my shorthand would basically be UK government needs to basically buy DeepMind out of Google, turn it immediately rather than nationalizing it, making it about us, make it part of an international consortium, something like CERN or the Human Genome Project, encourage other leading organizations like the Allen Institute or OpenAI or a similar institute in China to join the fray and collectively sort of ensure that whatever we build is built not as part of a race, but directed at this end state of something that humanity collectively scrutinizes. But that is, you say that to someone in Whitehall and they're like, hang on, just tell me what I can definitely get done today. But I think that will increasingly be the tenor of the debate if they continue to make big strides at developing AGI.
Let me jump in on my vision of corporate governance. I think that's a really interesting idea that you kind of try to extract some of this technology out of companies and put it into a CERN-like body. But ultimately, I think we need to recognize that government today actually shapes our companies. This idea that somehow companies exist in a vacuum, that they exist in this free market, and that they're not shaped by our tax policy, that they're not shaped by, for example, in the US, I don't know if it's quite what the variation is in the UK, but the corporate governance that says you have a fiduciary obligation to your shareholders, but not to society, not to your customers, not to anybody else but your shareholders. That is, to me, the really broken part of corporate governance. Because if in fact you had that same kind of fiduciary obligation to society, to your community, to your customers, to your employees, that you are now told you have only to your shareholders, I think we'd have very different kinds of companies.
Yeah, and that goes to a point we always make also in our work, both the research and the teaching in IAPP, which is markets are actually outcomes, right? They're outcomes. There's no deterministic market pressure kind of forcing companies, for example, to be short-termists. Markets are outcomes of how we govern organizations, both within the private sector, those issues you were just mentioning, but also within the state. If the state sees its role as simply, at best, fixing market failures, as opposed to actively co-creating and co-shaping markets, it will act differently. And this idea that actually the role of policy is leveling the playing field is completely false. Even deregulation tilted the playing field in a particular way for the very reasons you were just talking, Tim. Anyway, I could go on forever on this. Let me bring in two more questions, unless Nathan, you wanted to say something. No, okay. So Eliel Camargo Molina says it's dangerous to try and define a closed openness where we rely on free to use while keeping resources protected behind a market model. How can we avoid giving more power and control to the main players as a byproduct of that openness? And there was another question more specifically by Francisco Diego, also on the kind of implications of that question I just read, which is this all creating more inequality in the world? Are we going faster and faster to the destruction of the environment and people in the Southern Hemisphere?
Can I jump on that latter question? I think one of the things that we have to clearly address, and I think perhaps Kate Raworth is another one of your visiting professors, Mariana, is how do we move forward within the confines of the planetary boundaries? It's clear in some of the examples that Ian and Nathan brought up, but there are many, many others that using AI systems to develop new materials, to develop alternatives to things that we have to produce from fossil fuels is vastly more energy efficient and requires vastly less material. It dematerializes the economy. It's cheaper to do things in silicon than it is to build lots of prototypes in the real world. And so I think we can say that this set of tools used appropriately could help deliver economic, health, public welfare with a lower footprint in terms of just the amount of stuff and the amount of carbon it requires to get done. Now, of course, anyone knows at the moment you sort of put a studio up in your garden, or you get a new desk drawer, you just fill it with more junk, right? Because your junk fills the space available. So that doesn't then tackle the value question. Well, apart from your lovely study, that doesn't tackle the values question, which is that we might reduce the material required to produce stuff by a factor of 1,000, but we might increase the consumption by a factor of 10,000. And I think on the inequality point, the evidence of the last 35 to 40 years has been that platform-based market business models that rely much more on intangible assets rather than tangible assets, of which AI is the best, latest, most powerful example, tend, given the framing of tax laws and the shareholder directives, tend very much to favor capital over labor in disproportionate ways. And so I think, given that we now know that, we can say, well, this is going to be the outcomes of the existing structures. If we're unhappy with those outcomes, we'll have to change the structures.
I want to be a little bit optimistic for LEL, because I think you definitely raise a very valid problem, and people have critiqued things like GDPR and other attempts to to sort of improve things as actually helping the big monopolies reinforce their moats. I think that the thing we talked about privacy preserving federated learning really is potentially a massive underpinning technology of a new economic model, because it enables people to collaborate across borders and across companies to build a shared model and a shared intelligence system that we all collectively own. So I think that the Open Mind project and that work is I think actually the most exciting development that could unblock the issue of sort of, doesn't openness ultimately enable the monopolists just to sort of cement their position by sort of, having the only resources that let them sort of, lobby and navigate the bureaucracy placed upon them by laws like GDPR. So I think that the federated learning, distributed privacy preserving machine learning is potentially going to be a really seismic shift in how this all works.
Can I ask you, Ian, to just reflect a bit more on also the question that was about the kind of Southern and Northern and kind of the geopolitical, because you've also written separately, related to, but separate from the State of AI report, that wonderful essay on AI nationalism. And another question that's just come in that maybe you can, again, develop more, reflecting on the whole nationalistic side of things, says that it's apparent that it's Caleb Meath, I hope I'm pronouncing that right. It's apparent that many of the big players in the AI field are American, and even non-American startup companies such as DeepMind have been purchased by larger American ones. Is it thus inevitable that AI firms, when they grow, will be bought up and will thus lead to further concentration of AI decision-making within the United States? So that kind of suggests there's some sort of, not so much natural evolution, but because of where the financing comes from, et cetera, that concentrates it in one part of the world. But you've also written about how political kind of decisions around nationalistic tendencies is also causing some, skewed distribution of this power.
Yeah, and I mean, this was definitely at the heart of that essay I wrote. And I think that the risk is essentially that you end up with, everyone being a customer state of America or China, or maybe a handful of other places. And there was this, this example at the time of, I think, a company called CloudWalk that was working with, I believe, the Zimbabwean government. And essentially, the Zimbabwean government was basically giving a Chinese company a bunch of, their citizens' images to train the Chinese company's model that would then be sold back to the Zimbabwean government to do facial recognition on their citizens. And so you've got this perfect example of a sort of customer state dynamic where, there's a sort of, very unhealthy relationship between a technology company of one state and the citizens of another. I think the answer, I think, again, to all of this is to ultimately focus on expanding the sort of global commons, because that is, the role that the middle countries like the UK or Singapore or Canada can play, where collectively, actually, we have quite a lot of mass and quite a lot of opportunity to contribute. But, operating as a single country, sort of trying to sort of fight back against, hegemony is potentially unlikely to be that successful. But I don't think it's inevitable. I think there's a real opportunity to sort of come together and figure out a way that is not just deferring to a few people in Washington.
But here the timing is quite important, as we outline in one of the predictions in the report that relates to the proposed transaction between NVIDIA and ARM. NVIDIA being, the most impressive graphics processing manufacturing company in the world, and has seen its equity value inflate like no else in the last few months. And ARM being the maker or designer of chips that feature 95% of all smartphones. And so the reunification of both companies, is another example towards Ian's point of how we just need to think about how quickly we step in and try and make sure that power doesn't concentrate all into the US. Because, in this case, for example, ARM was born as a British company, but and it has hundreds of suppliers, if not more. And so there's a real tension now between NVIDIA being the biggest business in the space, can now dominate essentially who has access to this kind of technology, and also can, by virtue of being in the US, be under oversight of CFIUS and other regulatory sort of mechanisms that the US president has to flex muscle over who has access to what. And so I think we're finally starting to see like other nations pipe up about their discontent of the transaction, and hopefully something happens here. But market forces might prevail where governments cannot step in fast enough.
Thank you. So a question from Diego Ordonio. He says, please let's talk about the social dark side of AI, which is often put aside. One of the very things driving progress in this space is the vast amounts of private data, our data now available, that anyone can easily buy or even download. How can AI evolve without being tied to real spillovers like social manipulation, invasion of privacy, or social blind grading? This, of course, is related to the great work of Shoshana Zuboff. We hosted a seminar by her a couple of years ago where her opening point was, you think Google's free? Guess what? Google's searching you for free. So again, this comes to the heart of our project on algorithmic rents and distinguishing the kind of bad from the good. What advice do you have for how we can both govern, but also actually understand precisely through reports like your own, the mapping of where the bad is happening and how to steer the development of this GPT, as you were saying, Ian, and towards what's actually going to benefit us as humanity as opposed to hurt us? I'll just open this up. I think you're on mute. Mute.
I feel like Azim was going to go on that one.
Azim, yeah.
Happy to quickly just say a couple of things. I mean, there's a wide spectrum of uses of these technologies, and Diego has identified one that we all touch on that is increasingly making people rightly very, very uncomfortable. There are many other incredible uses, and we just have to think about what we're able to now do with very low cost genomic reads. The UK Biobank, for example, can now do very, very smart things because it has got, in trust in some sense, the full readout of hundreds of thousands of people and their sort of phenotypic expression as well. So the thing that strikes me about this is that it does require some thought about what kind of intervention we need where. It's clear, and I'm sorry to keep going on about kind of commons and public goods and so on. It's clear that there is a role in some areas, for example, in health data, where aggregate data is incredibly valuable and really very, very helpful and better if it's stewarded well. And there may be technical ways of doing that, the sort of federated privacy or differential privacy approaches that Ian has talked about earlier. And there may also be governance mechanisms or legal mechanisms like data trusts or data commons, which steward the data for some kind of benefit. And I think that we have to move quite quickly to expand those types of institutions. When it comes to the idea of, personalized advertising and the trade in, which movie I watched last night, I mean, it just strikes me as such a banal use. I'm just not sure why we don't all move to agree to stop doing it. But perhaps I'm just really naive. Like we should just stop it. Let's just stop it.
Just on that one point you just mentioned, another one of our visiting professors, professors of practice, Francesca Bria, she used to work with the city of Barcelona, and the mayor, Ada Colau, actually brought in to the city team, so the civil service, a group of hackers whose task it was to actually find ways for all the data that was being generated in the city every time people clicked on something like Citymapper, to be non-intermediated between the city and this data creation and the provision of better public transport, right? And public transport that was greener, more sustainable, but also just really benefiting citizens. And I think that partly goes to the heart of what you're talking about. Does someone else want to say something based on this other question, or should I read more?
The one thing I would say is, outside of, it's like to Azim's point about the positives here, we think that AI is going to increasingly be contributing to the frontier of scientific knowledge and participating in our our scientific process to discover things. And so there's a very interesting question here of, historically, of like a large amount of science has been effectively sort of part of the commons. What happens when you have a number of powerful organizations pushing science forward, but doing it from within a corporate structure using this technology? And so I think I actually worry more about what happens to science than I do about what happens to our personal data.
There's a great question here that actually makes me think of your analogy with CERN, but with the FDA here. So it's by Camille Khan. He says, given there is no FDA, so Food and Drugs Administration, type authority to regulate this sector, issues of fairness arise in using AI in the criminal justice sphere, and private prison interests have hijacked algorithms being used in determining reoffending for the purposes of parole and bail. This raises huge issues under Article 6 of the European Convention on Human Rights. Further, given that details on the algorithms are proprietary, there may be no disclosure on their operation to courts. How do you see fairness being addressed in the use of algorithms, and how to stop this concerning trend? Which I think also goes to your point in the beginning around transparency.
We actually did quite a decent section this year on sort of ethical issues that arise from deploying these systems in a civic context. So in the judiciary, in policing, and things like the exam grades sort of situation in the UK. And there have been some really, really innovative pieces of work by legislators around this that we feature in the report. I think it's the one that really caught my attention was, I think it was off the top of my head in Colorado. There's this mandate that the machine learning system being used in a specific sensitive context, and this was a law enforcement context, has to be available to third parties to audit via an API. So you're essentially saying this system is now effectively open to anyone who wants to basically probe it for vulnerabilities and bias. The other thing that is very encouraging on this front is there's a set of researchers who've been pushing the boundaries of pushing the agenda of talking about the stuff you've been raising, and they've basically been ignored, I would say, for the last few years. And this is the year where it feels like suddenly all the stuff they've been warning around has kind of hit the mainstream, and we kind of draw a line between some of the great research by people like Timnit Gebru.
Can I throw something in? Sorry, you had frozen and I thought you'd stop talking. Continue.
No, go for it.
That's always a good excuse.
I was just going to say, I like to say AI is a mirror, not a master. When we talk about bias in algorithms, it's showing us our bias. It's showing us the bias in the data that we fed it. It's not like the algorithm has the bias. We have the bias. And so for me, there's an enormous opportunity to use this to debug our society in some sense. You build, and to use this AI moment to say, oh, we built this model, we fed it, what we collectively believe to be truth, and this is how it's acting. And you go, holy shit, that's us? We shouldn't be saying that's the algorithm. We should be saying that's us. And how are we going to fix us? And that's the opportunity here.
I agree with that, and I think the challenge is just that the people developing this and the people deploying this are within the existing power structures, and so all of the it's currently it's not going well. But I agree with you that is the opportunity.
Yeah.
And in a future session, we want to invite a friend of ours, Joy Buolamwini. I can't pronounce it properly. Sorry, Buolamwini. That both Tim and I shared the stage with in Bellagio for a Rockefeller conference. She's fantastic on exactly these issues, which we want to focus on actually around the ethics and the biases and what to do about it in another session. Today's more the geeky report session, isn't it? So a great question from Rosie Collington, who is also one of our PhD students. She says, is it possible to have truly global open data innovation within an industrial system that ultimately is premised on profits and capital accumulation, or are these mutually exclusive? So kind of, it goes to the heart of, how can, is it related also to the type of capitalism that we have, and what would this look like under a different type of more, whether it's stakeholder driven that Tim was talking about or other? Tim, sure.
I think, let me jump on this really quickly. I think there's a beautiful synergy between this question and the work that we're all doing on mission-driven innovation. Because in some sense, the capitalism that we have today is a capitalism that is empty of purpose. And if you look, for example, at the capitalism that was harnessed and put to work, during World War II and thereafter, it was mission driven. It was like, oh my gosh, we have this enormous, threat, and in the post-war years, it was, oh my gosh, we have this disaster that we have to rebuild from. And I actually think that tackling some of the challenges like climate change that we're facing, like emergent pandemics, has the possibility to give us a better version of capitalism that is more mission driven, that's less about profit. Now, again, so far, we're not seeing that. We're seeing, all these, pharma companies on the race to the vaccine, and they're going to still charge an arm and a leg, despite the fact that they're getting a lot of the research provided by, government funds and so on. But I do think there is an opportunity there to bring those two threads together. It's, inclusive capitalism is a great idea, and I'm totally supportive of it. But I think there's almost three legs to the stool. There's the mission driven. Are we actually solving the hard problems for humanity? Are we bringing everyone along with us? And are we allowing companies to make a profit so that they have that self-interest? But basically, that's not the dominant. Right now we have a capitalism that's a one-legged stool.
Yeah, and as you know, this is very much the focus of what we do in the Institute. But I think sometimes when we think of missions, it kind of, there's a misperception that it's just about the goal, right? So, getting to the moon and back. But what's really interesting about that, I'm actually writing a book on the details around that, how we actually got to the moon and back also was governed with particular types of contracts that defined how NASA related to the private sector. There was many different types of private companies that helped out to get there and back, General Electric, Honeywell, Motorola. But if you actually look at the contracts, the procurement contracts, they were much more symbiotic than anything we see today in the health innovation space. And that does bring it back to not just governance in terms of regulation, but literally governance in terms of the ecosystem, the public-private partnerships. And for that, we need to think about, again, stakeholder capitalism, not as a corporate governance issue, but systemic at the center of capitalism, how all the different collective value creators relate one to another.
And your point here, like if you look at these pharma contracts today, around the pandemic, government is in a prime position to negotiate on behalf of the public, and instead they're just abdicating.
Remdesivir, the drug being put out by Gilead, is going for more than $3,100 per dosage, and it received $71 million from the U.S. taxpayer. Anyway, so unfortunately, or fortunately for those who are starving, it's 7:30, at least in London. And we're going to officially close, but I'm going to let all of you maybe just say one last thing that you want to say in less than a minute, all of you panelists. How about if I begin with Nathan?
Yeah, I was just going to jump and give a quick example, like to the contrary in the pharma industry, of a partnership called Melody, which is actually a public-private consortium between large pharma companies and governments, 3 years of funding. And the explicit purpose of that is to try and share data related to small molecules for drug discovery. And so I think it's an interesting example of probably an industry that's the most fiercely competitive and kind of game theoretical, that is running an experiment, probably small in the scheme of things, but trying to explore whether there is actually some more signal that can be derived from collaboration. So I think there's some light here, and the key thing is to try and draw attention to it and magnify it.
Great. Azim?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really exciting time. And my message is that we can all fall foul of, an Earth-centric view of the world, a now-centric view of the world. A general purpose technology changes every aspect of society. And if Ian and Nathan are right with their evidence that this is the most powerful general purpose technology we've seen for a while, we should be prepared and excited about the coming years where we get to change every aspect of society.
Great, thanks.
100%.
Ian?
I'm totally with you on that. Such an opportunity. We're facing an enormous opportunity. We should be excited and trying to rise to the challenge.
Is that your bit, or is that what you're going to say? Very good, very positive. Thanks, Ian.
No, I know yeah, that I completely agree. I mean, I think that the direction of travel is worrying, and I think it's incumbent on us to have a sort of clear-eyed view that there's a real opportunity to change that direction of travel, and that's the work to be done.
Great, thanks. And for all the participants that are US citizens, please vote right away. Okay, well, great. On that, thank you, everyone. Thank you so much to Ian and Nathan for patiently and also selectively going through your report. As you said, there's hundreds of other bits of it that you didn't have time to go through, so it is available on the web. Just Google State of AI. Thank you, Azim and Tim, for being wonderful panelists. And this is an ongoing conversation that we'll be having in IPP with other public lectures of this sort. The video will be on YouTube, so you can share it with others who haven't been able to join us today. And thank you to all the participants, the wonderful questions. And sorry we weren't able to answer them all. But anyway, have a wonderful evening or morning, depending where you are. Thanks to everyone.
Thanks.
Bye.